I got an email last week from a guy named Luke who worked as an overnight maintenance caretaker at a semi-abandoned highway bypass tunnel in the Cascade Mountains, and he included a digital scan of a shift log from the winter of 1984 that has honestly made me look at the roads I drive on a little differently. He was hired by the State Transportation Department to monitor the structural integrity of the old tunnel, which had been closed to the public decades ago due to unstable rock formations, but was kept as an emergency detour route for heavy freight. Something about the way Luke describes the absolute silence of those concrete walls and the specific smell of the air before things started to shift feels completely authentic. And I think you'll understand why he hasn't been back to that part of the state since his contract ended. I found a brand new wet umbrella leaning against the wall of a subterranean safety shelter that has been locked from the outside since 1981, and the water dripping from it smelled like my wife's favorite shampoo. My name is Luke, and for 3 years I worked as an overnight monitor for the State Transportation Department at the Kettle Ridge Emergency Bypass Tunnel, a 3-mile stretch of 2-lane highway bored through a granite peak that had been bypassed by a modern 4-lane bridge in the early 80s. The tunnel was only used about twice a year for military transports or heavy hazardous chemical loads that weren't allowed on the main bridge, and my job was to sit in a small concrete control booth embedded midway through the tunnel from 10:00 p.m. to 6:00 a.m., checking the carbon monoxide sensors and ensuring the drainage pumps stayed clear. It was a tedious, lonely gig that paid nearly double what I was making as a standard road crew tech, which was exactly what I needed at the time to help my wife, Sarah, finish her degree in dental hygiene. The routine was always the same. I'd park my truck at the west portal gate, unlock the heavy padlock on the chain link barrier, drive my small electric utility cart into the dark of the tunnel, and lock the gate behind me. The tunnel was a cold, damp cylinder of grey concrete, lit only by a single row of low-wattage yellow bulbs that hung from the center of the ceiling like dirty teeth. The air down there always had a specific smell, a mixture of old diesel soot, damp rock, and the chemical tang of the rust, inhibiting grease they sprayed on the massive ventilation fans. My supervisor was an older guy named Cobb, a guy who had worked for the state for 30 years and had about 6 months left until his pension kicked in. Cobb didn't like to talk on the radio unless it was absolutely necessary, and his shift hand-offs in the parking lot were always short. "Watch the pressure gauges on the drainage lines, Luke," Cobb told me on my first night of the winter season, his voice sounding dry and gravelly as he leaned against his truck door. "The mountain gets heavy when the snow starts to melt on the ridge, and the water table will try to push through the concrete joints. If the pumps kick on, you'll hear a thumping in the pipes. Don't go looking for it. It's just the head pressure clearing out the silt." I asked him about the emergency cross passages, the small chambers every half-mile that were meant to serve as safety shelters in case of a fire or a cave-in. "They're sealed," Cobb said, pulling his collar up against the cold wind. "Locked from the outside with heavy iron bolts. Nobody's been inside those rooms since the state did the seismic retrofit back in '81. Don't worry about them. Just stay in the booth and keep the logs green." For the first month, the job was as boring as I'd hoped. I'd spend my nights reading paperback novels, drinking black coffee from a thermos, and listening to the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation fans, which ran on low speed 24 hours a day. The fan noise was a constant, vibrating background hiss that made the back of my neck feel numb, and when the wind outside the mountain shifted, the pressure in the tunnel would change, making my ears pop with a soft, wet sound. But on a Tuesday night in early December, during a heavy sleet storm that had slowed traffic on the main bridge to a crawl, I was doing my midnight foot patrol of the eastbound lane. I had my heavy-duty flashlight in one hand and my clipboard in the other, my boots making a slow, hollow clack on the damp asphalt. I reached Chamber 7, which was located right at the midpoint of the tunnel, about a quarter mile from my control booth. The heavy iron door was painted a faded industrial orange, and it was secured by a massive, rusty padlock that had been coated in cosmoline to prevent corrosion. I stopped because I noticed that the grease on the padlock looked clean. It wasn't the dull, dusty grey of 30 Year-old grease. It was bright yellow and smelled faintly of petroleum. I reached out and touched the lock, and the metal was warm. Not hot, but room temperature, which made no sense in a tunnel that was a constant 42 degrees. I pulled my keys out of my pocket, found the old brass master key, and slid it into the keyway. The lock opened with a smooth, silent slide of the internal tumblers that told me it had been lubricated recently. I slid the heavy iron bolt back and pushed the orange door open, the hinges screaming with a high-pitched squeal that echoed down the tunnel for a mile. I pointed my flashlight beam into the small, concrete room. It was supposed to contain a first aid kit, a direct dial emergency phone, and some old wool blankets in a zinc chest. But the room was empty except for a brand new, black-handled umbrella leaning against the back corner. The nylon was wet, and a small pool of water had collected on the dusty concrete floor beneath it. I walked over and picked it up, my heart doing a strange, slow thump in my chest. The water on the umbrella was fresh, and as I held it, a scent drifted up to my face. The sharp, sweet smell of herbal lavender, the exact shampoo that Sarah had been using for years. I stood in that tiny, concrete room for a long time, the flashlight beam trembling slightly against the damp walls. I told myself that some hiker or urban explorer must have found a way into the tunnel through one of the vertical ventilation shafts on the mountain ridge and had used the chamber to dry off. But how had they unlocked a padlock that was locked from the outside? And why did the water smell like my own bathroom in Bend? I took the umbrella, walked back out to the tunnel, and locked the orange door behind me, making sure the bolt was fully engaged. I drove my utility cart back to the control booth, my mind trying and failing to find a logical explanation. I picked up the radio to call Cobb, who was supposed to be on standby at the district maintenance yard 10 miles away. "Cobb, you there?" I asked, my voice sounding flat in the small, concrete booth. It took a few seconds for the speaker to crackle to life, Cobb's voice sounding distant and muffled by static. "Yeah, Luke. What do you need? The storm's getting bad up on the pass. We've got plows out." "Cobb, did you do an inspection of Chamber 7 today?" I asked, looking at the black umbrella leaning against the wall of the booth. "I found some wet gear in there. Looks like someone's been using the room." The radio went silent for a few beats. Just the low, pulsing hiss of the static. "Chamber 7, Cobb said, his tone dry and slightly annoyed. "I told you, Luke, nobody's opened those chambers in 40 years. The keys are in the safe at the district office. If someone's in the tunnel, they're trespassing. Call the state patrol if you think you've got an intruder." "The lock was lubricated, Cobb," I said, leaning toward the microphone. "And there was an umbrella in there. It was wet. It's still dripping. Must be a leak in the roof, Luke," Cobb replied, his voice fading slightly as if he was moving away from his radio. "The granite's got fractures. Sometimes the water comes through the joints and looks like a drip. Just write it down in the log and keep an eye on the CO sensors. I'm going to go check on the plow crews." I set the radio down, the plastic cold against my hand. I knew the difference between a roof leak and a wet umbrella. I sat at my desk and looked at the television monitors that showed the feeds from the east and west portals. The gates were closed. The heavy steel barricades were locked with thick chains. There were no tire tracks in the slush outside the gates, and the security cameras showed nothing but the grey, swirling sleet falling under the high-pressure sodium lights. I called my house in Bend. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah picked up, her voice sounding thick and sleepy. "Luke," she whispered. "Is everything okay? What time is it?" "It's 2:15. Sarah," I said, my voice sounding tight as I looked at the umbrella. "I'm sorry to wake you. I wanted to hear your voice. Are you at home?" I heard her rustle the blankets over the phone, a soft, dry sound. "Of course I'm at home." "Luke, where else would I be? The roads are terrible. The radio said the highway through the pass is closed to public traffic. Are you safe in the booth?" "Yeah, I'm safe," I said, my hand gripping the receiver. "I just had a weird dream, I guess. Go back to sleep. I'll be home by 7. "Okay," she said, her voice trailing off. "Be careful on the drive. I love you." She hung up, and the dial tone filled the room, a flat, electric hum that sounded identical to the ventilation fans. I sat there for another hour, trying to read my book, but my eyes kept drifting to the floor of the booth. A small, dark circle of water had formed on the grey linoleum beneath the umbrella, and the smell of lavender was getting stronger, filling the small concrete room, until it felt like I was standing in the shower at home. I decided to do another drive, through of the tunnel on my cart to clear my head. I got on the utility cart and started driving toward the east portal, the little electric motor whining quietly in the damp air. The concrete walls passed by in a monotonous blur of grey and white, the yellow lights overhead casting long, rhythmic shadows that slid across the asphalt like dark fingers. As I passed mile marker 2, the cart's headlights caught something on the ground near the center line. I slowed down and stopped. Lying in the middle of the road was a pair of black rubber floor mats. I got off the cart, my boots making a quiet splash in a shallow puddle of drainage water. I bent down and picked them up. They were heavy, made of thick, ribbed rubber, and they were caked in dry, grey mud. I flipped them over, and my chest felt like it was being squeezed by an iron band. They were the exact floor mats from my own Honda Civic, the ones I'd bought at an auto parts store in Bend 2 months ago. On the driver's side mat was a small, crescent-shaped burn from a cigarette I dropped last week, and a white coffee stain on the corner from a leaky travel mug. I stood in the middle of the empty lane, the floor mats in my hands, looking back toward the west portal. The tunnel was empty. There was no sound but the low, distant rumble of the fans and the dripping of water from the ceiling joints. I ran back to the utility cart, threw the mats onto the floorboards, and drove back to the control booth, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I parked the cart, ran into the booth, and checked the computer log. The digital telemetry screen was flickering, the green text scrolling rapidly. Station 4 active. Station 4 was the vehicle detection loop buried in the asphalt at mile marker 1.5. I looked at the automated vehicle log. The system had recorded a vehicle entry at 1:45 a.m. from the west portal. The license plate listed on the screen was mine. Iwai. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type. I checked the camera feeds for the west portal gate again. The gate was closed. The padlock was still on the chain. I looked at the video feed for the interior of the tunnel at mile marker 1.5. The camera showed nothing but the empty concrete lane and the yellow lights. There was no car. There were no headlights. I picked up the satellite phone to call the state patrol, but before I could dial, the landline rang. The sound was incredibly loud in the small room, a harsh, mechanical ring that made me drop the receiver. I picked it up with a trembling hand and pressed it to my ear. "Luke," a voice said. It was Sarah, but she didn't sound like she was at home in Bend. Her voice was flat, dry, and she sounded like she was speaking through a heavy blanket. "The highway is blocked, Luke. They told me to take the bypass. I'm at the gate now, but it's so dark in here." "Sarah, no?" I screamed, my voice cracking with panic. "The bypass is closed. You can't be in here. I called you 20 minutes ago and you were in bed. How did you get to the pass?" "The rain is so heavy, Luke," she said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that sounded exactly like the ventilation fans. "I can't see the road. I'm turning into the tunnel now. I can see your light." The line went dead, the static returning with a sudden, wet hiss. I stood up, my chair knocking over against the wall, and looked out the window of the control booth. The tunnel stretched out to the left and right, empty and grey under the yellow lights. But then, far down the eastbound lane toward the west portal, I saw a light. It wasn't the high-pressure sodium lights of the ceiling. It was a pair of yellow headlights, dim and yellow, cutting through the damp mist of the tunnel. The car was moving slowly, very slowly, its tires making a quiet, wet squelch on the asphalt. It was a silver Honda Civic. My car. I ran out of the control booth, my flashlight in my hand, and stood in the middle of the road. I pointed my light at the windshield, but the glass was covered in a thick layer of grey, wet mud that had been smeared by the wipers, making it impossible to see inside. The car stopped about 20 feet from me, the engine idling with a quiet, familiar rattle that I'd heard every morning when I started it for work. I walked toward the driver's side door, my boots feeling heavy, like they were stuck to the asphalt. The air smelled of burnt grease, lavender, and old rubber. I reached out and touched the door handle. The metal was ice, cold, so cold that my skin stuck to it for a fraction of a second. I pulled the handle, and the door swung open with a dry, rusty creak. Sitting in the driver's seat was a figure. It was wearing my red flannel shirt and my work boots, and its hands were wrapped around the steering wheel. But the skin on its face and hands wasn't skin. It was dry, grey clay, cracked at the joints like an old mud flat, and its eyes were just two smooth, black stones pressed into the sockets. Resting in the passenger seat next to the figure was a black-handled umbrella, wet and dripping, and on the dashboard was a small, plastic cup filled with dry grey soil. The figure slowly turned its head toward me, the clay around its neck cracking with a dry, papery sound. It opened its mouth, but there was no tongue, no teeth. Just a small, black speaker horn mounted in the back of its throat. "You're doing a great job, Luke," the speaker whispered, using Cobb's voice. "The state is very pleased with the maintenance. We just need one more scan. The 3rd mile is where the drainage is clear." The figure reached out and grabbed my arm, its hand dry and rough like sandpaper, and the grip was incredibly strong, like an iron vice. I screamed, pulling back with all my weight, but the clay fingers didn't budge. I swung my heavy flashlight with my other hand, hitting the figure's wrist. The clay shattered with a loud, dry crack, and the hand broke into a dozen grey pieces that dissolved into the water on the floorboard of the car before they even hit the rubber mats. I fell backward onto the asphalt, scrambling to my feet, and ran toward the west portal gate. I didn't go back to the control booth. I didn't get my bag. I just ran down the concrete lane, my chest burning, my boots splashing in the drainage puddles. The yellow lights overhead seemed to stretch, the distance between them growing longer and longer, until it felt like I was running down a hallway that had no end. I reached the west portal gate. The chain link barrier was locked, the padlock in place. I climbed over the top, the rusted wire tearing my shirt and cutting my hands, and I tumbled down into the slush on the other side. My truck was parked in the driveway, its windows covered in a thin sheet of sleet. I got in, my hands shaking so hard I dropped the keys twice, and I turned the engine over. It started on the first try, the headlights cutting through the dark of the mountain pass. I drove down the pass as fast as the tires would let me, not looking at the rearview mirror, my mind a blur of terror and confusion. I reached my house in Bend at 5:00 a.m. The lights were out. I ran through the front door, my boots leaving a trail of wet slush on the carpet, and I burst into the bedroom. Sarah was in bed, sleeping quietly under the heavy blankets. I stood by the bed, my chest heaving, my hands covered in grease and dried blood from the fence. I reached out and touched her shoulder, and she stirred, her eyes opening slowly in the dim light of the morning. "Luke," she whispered. "What's wrong? You look awful." "Sarah, I'm home," I sobbed, my knees buckling as I sank to the floor beside the bed. "I'm home. I'm not going back to the tunnel. I'm done." She looked at me, her expression soft and concerned, and she reached out to touch my face. Her hand was warm and soft, and the smell of lavender was fresh on her skin. But as she smiled, her lips cracked slightly at the corners, and a tiny, thin line of grey clay dust fell onto the white sheet. "That's good, Luke," she said, her voice sounding flat, dry, and rhythmic, exactly like the ventilation fans. "We've got the new floor mats in the car. We're ready for the transfer." I didn't answer her. I stood up and backed out of the bedroom, my heart cold, and walked to the front door. I looked out the window. My truck was parked in the driveway, but the street wasn't a street in Bend. The asphalt was damp and grey, and it ran between two high, vertical walls of rough, cut limestone that stretched up into a grey, flat sky where the sleet was falling in silent, vertical lines. In the distance, at the end of the road, I could see the dark, circular opening of a tunnel, its yellow lights blinking in the mist. I'm sitting in my truck now, the heater running on high, but the air coming through the vents still smells of old diesel soot and damp stone. I've been driving for 3 hours, but every road I take, every highway exit I follow, eventually brings me back to the entrance of the Kettle Ridge bypass. Cobb's voice came through my truck radio 10 minutes ago, telling me that my shift is almost over and that I need to make sure the gate is locked. I'm going to go down to the gate now. The padlock is waiting, and I can hear the big fans starting to thrum in the dark. I tried to contact the state transportation department to verify Luke's employment, but they told me that the Kettle Ridge Tunnel had been completely filled with concrete in 1985 after a major rockfall, and they haven't had a maintenance caretaker on site for nearly 40 years. But the scan Luke sent me is definitely a real shift log, and when you look at the signature on the last page, the ink has a strange, greyish tint to it, almost like it was written with liquid clay instead of ink. If any of you have ever driven through those old mountain passes, or if you've seen those old orange doors in the side of a highway tunnel, let me know in the comments. Sometimes I think the roads we build aren't just for driving, they're for keeping the things we've forgotten from finding their way back to the light. Stay safe and watch the rearview mirror.